The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. In Parliament this afternoon, housing in the heartlands, two big topics that hit close to home for Singaporeans. First, the government is getting ready to roll out VERS, the voluntary early redevelopment scheme. Minister Chee Hong-tat stressed today that it won't be another SERS and definitely not a lottery effect where some homeowners strike gold. But if compensation is lower, will homeowners take part? And what does this mean for those who see their flat as both home and asset? Still in Parliament today, rents for heartland shops have been climbing and in some cases doubling in just a year. That's everything from coffee shops to GP clinics. Senior Minister of State for National Development Sun Ling says HDB may step in to acquire shops and lease them directly. But will this really keep heartlands affordable? Well, joining us today is Nicholas Mak, Chief Research Officer at MOGUL.sg. Hi, Nick. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Nick, Minister Chee emphasized that VERS is meant for orderly renewal and not wealth creation. But can we really strike that right balance between providing fair compensation and avoiding a windfall effect?
Well, I think that's quite possible, but it also requires a change of mindset of HDB flat owners as well as the potential buyers, because some of the buyers are still under the old mindset that VERS would be something similar to SERS, S-E-R-S, the Selective En Bloc Redevelopment Scheme. So there are still people who think that, well, the government's going to provide this safety net where the value of the flat is not going to fall down to zero. So there's no harm in buying or paying a high price for older flats. And I think the government needs to change that mindset.
Okay, well then how is the government defining fair compensation for VERS as well, considering the flats will have much shorter leases compared to SERS acquired flats?
Let's say every HDB flat, when it's sold directly by the government as a new flat, starts off with a 99-year lease. In other words, the owner of the flat has the right to use that flat for the next 99 years. Of course, during that time, the flat will be passed through the hands of different owners. Let's say the flat is left only 30 years left on the lease. So if the government is going to, let's say, that cluster of flats, all the owners vote for, or majority of the owners vote for the VERS program, then the government will need to send in independent valuers who will value how much is the value of the flat, considering that right now it's only 30%, only left 30 years, 30% of that original or the value of a brand new 99 years flat. And that will set the basis of the valuation, and that is what the government may compensate the owners. Of course, the government can give something a bit extra, some ex gratia grants and so on, to compensate the owners for the inconvenience of moving. The government can also offer the owners replacement flats, perhaps at BTO prices, if they're eligible for such things, or perhaps even letting the owners buy a new flat at a longer lease so that they can stay there until the age of 95 or beyond.
Then looking back, what were the main lessons from SERS that impacted the design of VERS, and how will policymakers avoid repeating past inequities?
Well, I think that in the past, the government was fairly generous with the SERS program, which led to this mindset that SERS, in a way, is like a lottery. I heard this from different people, including some property agents. But it is a very expensive exercise for the government to make a cluster of flats to go through SERS. So right now, what the situation facing the Singapore property market is that there is about 1.15 million HDB flats. And about 1 in 5 of these flats are 50 years old or older. In other words, we are saying about 1 in 5 flats has already crossed the midway point of their 99-year lease. 10 years from now, that proportion is going to rise to 45% to 50% of the current stock of HDB flats. The government, sooner or later, will need to do something about it. And if they were to be Santa Claus, be so generous and keep on dishing out goodies, somebody will have to pay for those goodies. And those somebody is quite likely the future generation or you and I, the current taxpayers.
Definitely. Well, then with SIRS, I mean, residents had the benefit of a new flat with a fresh 99-year lease, often with little out-of-pocket costs. So if VERS cannot promise a similar upside, what incentives will be given to residents to encourage participation?
Well, I think one key advantage is that the residents, let's say the existing flats is left with 30 years lease, the government can offer them new HDB flat, perhaps also with a 30-year lease, but at least the flat will be brand new. You see? So they can have the choice of moving from a 70-years-old flat into a brand new flat. But if let's say they don't want to top up any additional funds, they will have the right to use that flat for the next 30 years. In other words, they are not shortchanged. They still get their 30-year lease, but this time in a brand new flat. And that should be a good enough incentive.
Okay. I mean, if compensation packages under VERS are perceived as inadequate, though, do you anticipate pushback or low take-up rates from residents?
Well, I think the government can actually, if the government wants to, use both a carrot and stick. Now, people have often been talking about the compensation side, which is the carrot side. The other side of it is the government can always say that, all right, I'm now offering this cluster of flats, all the residents here and the owners, the VERS program. You can vote on it. If you don't vote, if you vote no, then I'll just take the offer and go to a different neighborhood, a different town. You just have to wait for your turn until maybe, I don't know when the government will come back to make the VERS offer again. It could be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. You just wait. But in the meantime, your flat's going to get older. Things are going to start breaking down. So think carefully about voting no. So you see, there is a cost for voting no.
Minister Chi also emphasized that VERS is about fairness to future generations with land returning to the state for new housing. So how will VERS account for households with, different financial and family circumstances, for instance, retirees versus young families?
Well, I think that especially for retirees, those that might be asset rich or cash poor, the government, I think the VERS program, one of the key considerations is that the government will not shortchange the existing owners. So if the existing owners, their flat is let's say they have a 4-room flat and it has a remaining lease of 30 years, the government can offer existing owner a brand new 4-room flat, also with a 30-year lease, and perhaps and also some money to compensate them for the relocation. Well, in a way, that owner is not shortchanged, and that replacement flat could be somewhere in the same neighborhood. Alternatively, the government can also offer them another flat anywhere else. Let's say the owner has plans to move to a different town, perhaps nearer to their relatives or adult children. So be it. In other words, the government can offer them choices. The government can even offer them to downsize, so that they can even get some money back from a 4-room flat to a 3-room flat, and the government will buy back in a way that lost in space.
Well, then, with about 2.5% of households not owning flats that last them till age 95, how does VERS fit into the broader housing strategy to, ensure homes for life?
Now, this is a matter of government policy. If the government wants to make sure that everybody has a home that can last them, or a HDB flat that can last them until the age of 95, when a cluster of flats vote positively to accept the VERS program, then the government can always say, well, for this group of owners, 2 to 3% of owners, if your neighbors all vote in favor of VERS, you have to get the flat that is going to last you to at least age 95 years. That can be a condition. Well, whether or not the government is going to implement such a rule, I think time will tell.
Definitely. Well, also, one concern is that once VERS is seen as less generous than SIRS, the resale market for older flats may weaken further. So looking ahead to the first half of the 2030s rollout, how will the government build trust in VERS so it is seen as a renewal program, rather than a diluted version of SIRS?
Yeah, there need to be some reality check or rather return to reality, because if right now there's some owners or sellers or programs and even agents or even the buyers are expecting that, there's no harm in paying top dollar for older flats because the government's going to come and bail me out. And in a way, SIRS is a form of government bailout. It is like a golden parachute. But the government can't be providing golden parachute to every HDB flat owners. So VERS, in a way, is also an exit strategy, but it will be something that's going to be fairer. And fairer not just to the flat owner, but also to everyone else in Singapore and the future generation.
Meanwhile, HDB may selectively acquire privately owned shops to stabilize rents in the heartlands here. Now, privately owned HDB shops currently make up more than half of the total stock, with many sold decades ago on long leases. So, Nick, what factors are being considered in deciding which shops to acquire and why now?
I think that the initial idea of selling HDB shops to the operator was a good one, to let the shop operator to have ownership of the shop that he owns so that he doesn't need to be a tenant all the time. But subsequently, that policy has in a way lost its way because the first buyer can sell it to the second buyer and the shop just keep changing hands. And nowadays, some of these HDB shops or shop houses are being bought up by corporations, companies, who basically they're not operating that mini mart or they're not operating the restaurants or the eating house in that shops. They are basically, because they bought the shops at high prices, they will need to recoup their investment. They will charge high rentals, which will actually eventually lead to high prices for the consumers in the HDB heartland. I think that it's time for the government to step in to basically buy back some of these shops that may be facing a lot of complaints from tenants about high rentals and such, and also eventually let the operator have a chance to actually not get pushed out of business because of high rentals.
Well, with around half of HDB shops privately owned, how will HDB, determine which units are necessary to take over?
I'm not sure how the government would do that. Perhaps one way is to look at those that have certain leases, because there are a few ways. There's more than one way to skin a cat. One method is that the government can see what kind of rentals they're charging. Those that are charging very high rentals, and perhaps the government can step in to have some sort of consultation with the owners. Another method is to see whether or not such shops are being owned by corporations, because in a way, HDB shops are shops in a HDB flat that is built by taxpayers' money, and they are subsidized properties, and in a way, they are supposed to serve the heartlanders, they are supposed to serve the residents and citizens around there. They are not meant, if the corporations wants to own real estate to collect rental, then do that for private properties. There is a market for it, and not to squeeze the rentals out of hardworking Singaporeans who are just trying to make a living in HDB shops.
Well, with rents in some privately owned units more than doubling in a year, what risks do you see for hawkers, family-run businesses, and medical services in the heartlands?
Well, if those shops are owned by corporations, then I think they are really at the mercy of landlord, which in a way means that the policy of HDB shops really needs a relook. They need to return to basic, which is that these are public properties. They are built by the government using taxpayers' money. They should go back to either the state, or they should go back to the operator who's actually working in that shop.
Right. And HDB has pointed out that rents for government leased shops have stayed stable while rents for private ones spike. So does this dual system risk creating distortions in the heartland retail market where some tenants face vastly higher costs simply because of the ownership structure?
I think it already has. Now the question is how to remedy it.
Right. Well, then, beyond stabilizing rents, how will HDB ensure, heartland shops remain viable and affordable in the long run?
It seems like the experiment to let market forces decide has already skewed the playing field much in favor of the big landlords at the expense of the small tenants. Then if in such a situation, the government do have a responsibility to come in to level the playing field so that, the government has various tools as its means. I'm not going to tell the government how to do their job. They have the means to level the playing field so that, and this is important, so that the cost of living doesn't rise just because corporations are rising the rents of HDB shops.
Definitely. Some great insights from you there. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining me today.
It's always a pleasure to be on your program.
Thank you. That was Nicholas Mak, Chief Research Officer at MOGUL.sg. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.